Welcome, friends, to a new episode of Asha and Ganga Jamni joint program. Today, we have a historian who is working on music, Dr. Katherine Schofield. Katherine Schofield, probably most of you would be knowing her by her earlier name, Catherine Butler Brown, is a historian of music and listening in Mughal India and the para-colonial Indian Ocean, and a senior lecturer at King's College, London. Catherine's research interests lie generally in the areas of South Asian music, the history of Mughal India up till 1858, Islam, and the intersecting histories of the emotions, the senses, aesthetics, ethics, and the supernatural. Working largely with Persian and latterly Urdu, sources for Hindustani music that circa 1570-1860. A recent work, she has established music as central to Mughal technologies of sovereignty and selfhood. Identified classicism processes at work in early modern Indian arts, located the relationship of Ragbala paintings to their melodic inspirations in shared notions of power, told tales about ill-fated courtesans and legendary ustads, and traced the lineage of the chief musicians to the Mughal emperors from Akbar to Bahadur Shah Zafar. Katherine is well known for her academic essays, including Did Aurangzeb Ban Music? Incidentally, this is a very well-read paper as far as we at Aligarh are concerned. In fact, we have introduced it as a part of our syllabus when we are dealing with Aurangzeb. Then she has written on questions for the historiography of the reign of Aurangzeb, music, art, and power in Adil Shahi Bijapur, and the courtesan tale, female musicians and dancers in Mughal historical chronicles. Her first book was an edited volume with Francesca Orsini, and we are going to have Francesca Orsini amongst our program after a few weeks. The book which Katherine wrote along with Orsini is Tellings and Texts, Music, Literature and Performance in North India, which was published in 2015 by Open Book Press. Her second book, Monsoon Feelings, A History of Emotions in the Rain, edited by Imke Rajamani and Margaret Parnau, was published by Niyogi Books in 2018. Also in 2018, she was a British Academy Mid-Career Fellow, presenting a series of public lectures and conversations at the British Library. These culminated in a set of professionally produced podcasts for the general listener. Histories of the Ephemeral, writing on music in late Mughal India 1748 to 1858, which at the moment is available on the SoundCloud, iTunes, and Google Play. Incidentally, she just told me that she is turning these, podcasts into a monograph. Between 2011-16, she was principal investigator at a well-funded European Research Council grant, 1.18 million euros, which was on musical transitions to European colonialism in Eastern Indian Ocean, which examined the history of transitions from pre-colonial to colonial musical fields in India and the Malay world circa 1750 to 1900 through multilingual, intermedial, and stereophonic research methods. She continues to curate the Shamsa database funded through this grant, which describes well over 300 major written sources, circa 1700 to 1900, for the history and analysis of North Indian music and dance in Mughal and British colonial South Asia. The Shamsa digital collection already constitutes the largest single repository of primary written sources on Indian music and dance in the world. She has also been a participant in both Jaipur Literary Festival and Lahore Literary Festival, and gave an online talk for the JLF Brave New World series with the Hindustani classical singer Vidya Shah on monsoon ragas. She also teaches the history of Bollywood film music at King's College, London. Katherine originally trained as a viola player before embarking on her doctoral work at SOAS, University of London, in the cultural history of North Indian music, followed by a research fellowship at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and a lectureship of Leeds. She is only one of the few who have worked on the medieval Indian music traditions. I would name a few other scholars who are working on music in 17th, 18th centuries of India. The others are, and I would like to name them, Dr. François Nalini Delvoye, and of course, who can forget Bonnie Wade and Alan Miner. I will also name another scholar. I think that her work has not yet been published, but Lamine Hashim Ali has a very beautiful chapter on music in her thesis, which was submitted to the University of Sydney. May I now invite and request Dr. Katherine Schofield to speak on the theme Hindustani musical culture under Mughal patronage 1593 to 1707. Dr. Schofield.
Thank you. Namaste, salam alaikum, adab, and hello. I'm going to switch screens now, and so that we can hopefully see some slides here. May I ask, can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to you on this subject, which has been my life's work so far. And as the great musician Tansen is said to have sung once, music is a vast ocean from which I could only ever drink one drop. And if that was true of the great Tansen, then it's 100 times truer of myself. I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you have. And also, if anybody wants to speak about the late Mughal periods and the period of the White Mughals, that's the current work that I'm doing at the moment. But we're going to go back now to the 17th century and to the period of canonization of Hindustani music theory in Persian and in Braj Bhasha, although I'll only be talking about the Persian epistemology system of knowledge today. Okay. Today, Hindustani music is recognized internationally as one of the world's great classical music traditions. Its 20th century appearance on the public stage as a national classical music for the respectable middle classes owes much to colonial era reforms. But it was largely under earlier Mughal and elite provincial patronage that the core practices and contours of the Hindustani system as we know it today were consolidated between the reigns of Akbar I 1556 to 1605, and Akbar II, Akbar Shah, 1806 to 1837. Hindustani music's roots and some of its forms are substantially older than this, of course. Written treatises on Indian music in Sanskrit, Sangita Shastra, date back well over a millennium before the arrival of Babur's armies on the plains of Hindustan. And in Persian, they date to as early as 1375. And of course, the great Amir Khusro was writing long before that too. Elite songs in rag and tal had become the preferred taste of Turkic as well as Hindu rulers across North India and the Deccan within a century of the slave dynasty's conquest of Delhi in 1206. In contrast, the first two Mughal emperors showed little interest in Hindustani musical forms, apparently. Babur was emperor of Hindustan for only 5 years, and Humayun spent a lot of his reign in exile in Iran. But thereafter, Mughal taste became geographically expansive, from Akbar's stables of musicians from Mashhad, Herat, and Gwalior to Jahangir's penchant for Timurid court songs, and from Aurangzeb's love of the Hindustani Pakawaj to his father's patronage of the maestro Shauqi, who struck Persian maqams and Hindustani rags from his West Asian tambur with equal finesse. But from the last half of Akbar the Great's reign, it was increasingly the elite theorized forms of Hindustani music, privileged and provincial courts from Kashmir to Arakan and Kathmandu to Bijapur, that engaged the Mughals' attention. These forms were principally the rags themselves, and a set of virtuosic song genres in rag and tal, composed in courtly registers of North Indian languages, Drupad, Khayal, Tappa, Tumri, Ghazal, Tarana, and instrumental forms on the Rudravina, Rabab, Pakawaj, Sarangi, Tambur, and from the 18th century sitar, tabla, and later sarod. As is still the case, except on grand occasions, these forms were performed as intimate chamber music by small professional ensembles comprised of 1 or 2 singers and accompanying instrumentalists. Women and transgender performers also danced. Beginning in Akbar's court, these forms and their performance practices became the closely guarded intellectual property of multi-generational guilds built around households of male hereditary professional musicians from the Kalawant, Qawwal, and Dhari communities and their disciples, which included the highest status female courtesans. After 1857, these lineage guilds, as we all know, became known by their current appellation, Gharana. By the time the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, ascended the throne, the discrete set of practices that still constitute the core repertoire and traditions of Hindustani music today had coalesced under Mughal and Rajput patronage. This makes this period critical in the history of Hindustani music. To steal Daniel Newman's famous line, however, this evening's talk is not about Hindustani music per se. Instead, I'm talking about its patrons and the place of Hindustani music in the thought and social life of Mughal listeners at the empire's height from around 1593 to 1707. My examination is based on a range of rich Mughal sources in Persian on sound, listening, and Hindustani music. That we know so much about Hindustani music in this period itself testifies to the fundamental importance of musical patronage to the Mughals and to the elites of various castes and creeds who helped run it and sustain its power. Indeed, it is music that is by far the best documented of all the arts and sciences cultivated in Mughal India. Hundreds of individual works on music from the Mughal period are still extant in Sanskrit, in the North Indian vernaculars, most notably Braj or Hindavi, and especially in Persian. Particularly significant with this evening's discussion is the most important cluster of Mughal treatises on Hindustani music, those written in Persian during the reign of Aurangzeb, 1658 to 1707, which had an explicitly canonizing intent. And this is a picture from the copy of the Miftah al-Sarod, which is currently in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And it's in a very, very delicate condition at the moment. So I was very, very lucky to be able to photograph it. And you're very lucky to be able to see this beautiful icon of Rag Meg. Music in the Mughal world was fundamentally wrapped up with ideas about pleasure and its place in the lives of elite listeners. Mughal understandings of the human being, and thereby of the social and political worlds, were dominated by two binaries deriving from the Persianate discourse on ethics and governance. These were, firstly, the inner struggle between reason and the emotions anger and desire, and secondly, an outer struggle between the domain of duty and the domain of manly pleasures in the case of desire and manly sports in the case of anger. In both, for virtue to prevail, reason and duty must ultimately subdue desire and pleasure. But this victory did not entail the annihilation of desire and pleasure. Instead, it demanded mastery over these domains. This mastery had to be displayed to the world if it will be deemed a virtue at all. The domain of pleasure, therefore, had an essential place and role to play in the inward and outward maintenance of Mughal power. The Mughals' successors, the British, utterly misunderstood the serious purpose of pleasure in the life of the Mughal court, with profound implications for Mughal history. Mughal historians themselves sometimes used the rhetorical trope of an excessive devotion to pleasure to signify a threat to the political order, which colonial historians then conveniently misread as a literal statement. But the colonizers principally deployed the slur of decadence to present British rule as a welcome relief to the Indian people. H.M. Eliot viciously denounced all Muslim rulers down to his own time, writing in 1849 as, I quote, sunk in sloth and debauchery and emulating the vices of a Caligula or a Commodus, unquote. From a Mughal perspective, however, duty was not possible without a circumscribed time and place for pleasure, and pleasure was thus a serious business subject to scientific rationalization. Patronage and connoisseurship of music, recited poetry, dance, and other ephemeral things were the core practices of the domain of pleasure in the Mughal world, which took place largely within the highly scripted, intimate social institution of what they usually refer to then as the majlis, and what we now refer to in relation to music as the mehfil. Music had a particularly important role to play in this space. Hindustani music was understood in Mughal writings to be the sonic vehicle of the emotions of joy, love, and longing, all of which belonged to the domain of desire. But as importantly, music's powers were construed as having a rational basis in mathematics, the purest of the Islamic exact sciences. Specifically, music was considered a direct channel of astral power over terrestrial affairs. Musical patronage and connoisseurship thus became a major social and political arena in which the inner struggle to place desire under rational control could be outwardly performed, with musical sound an indispensable agent in this effort. Important here is the idea of aesthetic sensibility, that is, one's emotional response to an object of art or beauty. Listening to music in the majlis or mehfil could still be dangerous because it played with the power of desire. However, through setting aside a defined place in Mughal life for artistic patronage, and by controlling the emotional effects of art through the exertion of rationality, Mughal men could cultivate and experience the finer sensibilities. An elite man's temperament could be restored through musical listening to the inner equilibrium required to carry out his worldly duties effectively. This theory of internal individual temperament and external workings in imperial service and artistic patronage was underpinned by wider understandings of the nature of the physical body, the five senses, and their relationship to emotional temperament. And it's this that I'm going to unpack for you this evening as we go along. So, Consider a pair of quotations concerning the two emperors who bookend the period examined in this chapter. Both are from authorized accounts. The first was written by Abul Fazl in 1593 about the Emperor Akbar. I cannot sufficiently describe the wonderful power of music, this talisman of knowledge. His Majesty pays much attention to music and is the patron of all who practice this enchanting art. There are numerous musicians at court, Hindus, Iranis, Turanis, Kashmiris, both men and women. The court musicians are arranged in 7 divisions, one for each day in the week. When His Majesty gives the order, they let the wine of harmony flow and thus increase intoxication in some and sobriety in others. The second quotation, written around 1684, concerns the Emperor Aurangzeb. Though he has collected at the foot of his throne singers who possess lovely voices and clever instrumental performers, and in the commencement of his reign used to hear them sing and play, and though he himself understands music well, yet now for several years past, on account of his great restraint and self-denial, he entirely abstains from this amusement. Mirza Mukarram Khan Safavi, who was an expert in the musical art, once said to His Majesty, "What is your Majesty's view of music?" The Emperor answered in Arabic, "It is mubah, permissible, neither good nor bad." The Khan asked, "Then what kind of it is, in your opinion, most worthy to be heard?" The Emperor replied, "I cannot listen to music without instruments, especially bakavij. But your instruments are unanimously prohibited, haram, so I have left off hearing singing too." Traditionally, these two quotations have been read as evidence of Akbar's love of music and his enthusiastic patronage of different cultures, and of Aurangzeb's hatred of music and his cultural narrow-mindedness. These anecdotes have then been read in terms of the two emperors' contrasting cultural policies. Such a reading may indeed be appropriate in the case of Akbar. Particularly important is work that highlights the centrality of Persian literature on ethics, akhlaq, in Abul Fazl's construction of Akbar as an ideal man and emperor, work by people such as Muzaffar Alam, Sanjay Subramaniam, and Polly Yohannan in particular. Nasiruddin Tusi's Akhlaq-i Nasiri, 1235, and Jalaluddin Davani's Akhlaq-i Jalali, circa 1453 to 78, were integral to the construction of the epitome of Mughal statecraft, Abul Fazl's Ain-i-Akbari of 1593. Indeed, Abul Fazl placed himself in Davani's lineage of disciples and famously used the emperor's body and its balanced temperament as a homology for imperial state and household in the opening chapter of the Ain-i-Akbari. "A king," he wrote, "is the origin of stability and possession. If royalty did not exist, the storm of strife would never subside, nor selfish ambition disappear. Mankind, being under the burden of lawlessness and lust, would sink into the pit of destruction. But by the light of imperial justice, some follow with cheerfulness the road of obedience, whilst others abstain from violence through fear of punishment, and out of necessity make choice of the path of rectitude. The emperor puts the reins of desire into the hands of reason. In the wide field of his desires, he does not permit himself to be trodden down by restlessness, nor will he waste his precious time in seeking after that which is improper. He makes wrath the tyrant pay homage to wisdom, so that blind rage may not get the upper hand, and inconsiderateness overstep the proper limits." He is continually attentive to the health of the body politic and applies remedies to the several diseases thereof. And in the same manner that the equilibrium of the animal constitution depends upon an equal mixture of the elements, so also does the political constitution become well-tempered by a proper division of ranks, and by means of the warmth of the ray of unanimity and concord, a multitude of people become fused into one body. Abul Fazl repeatedly explored the many ways in which Akbar was the supreme example of Mughal manhood, the insani kamil, the perfect man, on which all other men should model themselves. But the individual to state homology falls apart under Aurangzeb, certainly in relation to music. For despite his reputation as being more rigidly prescriptive than Akbar, and despite his personal renunciation of music in 1668, Aurangzeb did not ban music. Far from it. Aurangzeb was known widely in his time as a most knowledgeable and dedicated connoisseur of Hindustani music. He certainly knew more about it than Akbar, and until his death in 1707, he continued to allow his sons, most prominently Muhammad Azam Shah, who himself wrote khayal compositions, and his nobility to patronize art music unhindered. And here we have a painting from the 1680s of noblemen enjoying some kalawants in the bottom right-hand corner there, playing for them on the riverbank in Imperial Agra. So then, if the emperor could renounce his role as cultural arbiter, as Shah Jahan and Muhammad Shah also did at times, the question then becomes, whence at such times did Mughal officials derive their models of ethical leadership in this arena? After Abul Fazl, influential advisors like Chandraban Brahman, who died in 1673, did not overtly prescribe the study of regnal histories for the ethical training of Mughal men, although they did mention them frequently, but rather the works on ethics themselves, the Akhlaq-i Jalali and the Akhlaq-i Nasiri. At this time, the specific model of the emperor was less important in an elite man's self-fashioning than more generic and widely available discourses on manhood. This became obvious in Aurangzeb's reign when the emperor largely withdrew from public participation in the cultural sphere, leaving the Mughal nobility to carry on without the emperor's presence as a model of behavior. In other words, it was the discourse that, in this case, set the pattern for modeling and not the emperor himself. Thus, the responses of Akbar and Aurangzeb to music should be read not as homologies of radically opposed cultural policies, but as two different and, crucially, equally legitimate responses to the absolute requirement for a man, and most particularly the ruler, to maintain at all times moral, mental, and physical equilibrium between competing internal powers. Together, these quotations lay bare the two nested sets of opposites that were counterpoised against each other in the moral and ethical systems of the Mughal Empire: reason versus desire and anger, and duty versus pleasure and sport. The opening passage of the Ain-i Akbari can also thus be used to show how akhlaqi theories about the self in action in the world could be personalized and activated in individual Mughal men. Abul Fazl's rhetorical flourishes concerning the emperor's reining in of his own desires and anger through reason and wisdom, and his creation of equilibrium and harmony in the body politic through the light of his justice, come from the akhlaqi theory of mind in relation to the body. According to the Akhlaq-i Jalali, two interlocking aspects created the human self: the disposition of the mind and the humoral constitution of the body. Both aspects needed to be held in balance in order for the self to act virtuously in the world. Let's begin with a potted summary of mind. And this is very simplistic for those of you who are aficionados of this literature. But we need to be simple here because it's quite tricky. For Diwani, the mind has two powers: the power of perception or comprehension and the power of incitement. The perceptive power incorporates the contemplative or observing intellect and the practical or active intellect, which through reason and rational decision enables the self to adopt right courses of action. The power of incitement incorporates the power of anger, the irascible faculty, which repels disagreeable things, and the power of desire, shahwi, the concupiscible faculty, which is drawn to agreeable things. By contrast, reason is construed as the superior power that distinguishes men and angels from beasts, the ruling and serene spirit the source of thought, judgment, and the desire to discern the truth of things. Human reason, Davani writes, the first power ought to have command over all the powers of the body, such that all are subdued beneath its influence, and each is compelled to do the work that this power assigns to them. It is by the other power's submission and subordination to the victory of this power that the government of man's internal state is regulated, lest states of disorder necessarily result. So, for good to prevail, the powers of incitement must be reined in by the power of reason. Under the regulating control of reason, its capacity to enforce equilibrium, ittidal, the powers of anger and desire can be transformed into virtues. If anger is cultivated rationally, it becomes courage, and desire, temperaments. Likewise, from the cultivation and exercise of the contemplative intellect comes wisdom. But it is the practical intellect that is the engine of equity or justice, adalat, and adalat is the paramount of the four cardinal virtues. The job of the practical intellect is to regulate the other three, bringing them into harmonious balance and perfecting them. Unrestrained by reason, courage slips from the virtuous mean and gives way to foolhardiness or cowardice, and temperance to greed or apathy. Without active judgment, constantly ensuring the maintenance of equilibrium, the whole system, individual body or bodily politic, collapses into vice and destruction. Okay, so body. The paramountcy of equilibrium is also central to the fundamental theory of the Greco-Islamic natural sciences, that all things, including human physiology, are constituted of four elements: fire, water, air, and earth. And these have significant parallels, including in the music treatises with Ayurvedic humoral medicine. These must be kept in equilibrium to ensure natural harmony. Equilibrium here being ittidal. Justice, adalat, and equilibrium, ittidal, have the same Arabic root, which Davani explicitly correlates, the first being responsible for mental health, the second for physical health. The powers of anger and desire could also be animated by humoral imbalance, anger being caused by an excess of yellow bile or desire by blood. Thus, someone with a predisposition towards biliousness would have a more difficult time using his rational mind to control the power of anger. Conversely, reason could marshal the external forces of humoral remedies, like music, to bring the powers of anger and desire back into appropriate subjection. Finally, before we move on from this little bit of technical description, even if one's mental disposition and bodily humours were perfectly regulated, if that remained hidden in the internal realm, the powers could not be made virtuous. Anger and desire could only become courage and temperance through action in relationships with others, that is, through outward exertion in the social world. The internal struggle between reason and desire thus had to be manifested externally in the domains of duty and pleasure. Moreover, the perfection of the virtues required social reciprocity. According to Davani, the perfection of the individual man depends on association and agreement with others. Without affectionate love, mahabbat, and like-minded friendship, ulfat, this cannot come into being. In other words, one's self-perfection, one's attainment of adalat, was only possible through the assistance of friends joined to oneself by bonds of affectionate love. Indeed, Davani goes on to say that where there is true affection, the need for equity or justice evaporates, making affectionate love a superior virtue even to justice. Revealingly, affectionate love was one of the chief outworkings of temperance, the primary virtue wrought from desire. And Davani considered the passionate love of human souls to be one of desire's key virtues. It should therefore be no surprise that the principal social arena in which friendship, affection, and love between Mughal men was nurtured was within the domain of pleasure, the primary domain centered upon the cultivation and control of desirable things and objects. In a nutshell, connoisseurship. This brings us to the social spaces in which the internal struggle for balance in relation to desire was displayed to the world. Connoisseurship, the province of the Ahl-i-Zawq or the Rasika, the one who tastes aesthetic pleasures and emotional essences, rasas, through a variety of sensory experiences, is an ideal arena in which to examine how Mughal men controlled desire publicly and reciprocally. This is particularly so of musical connoisseurship, because music was perceived to mediate the pains and delights of human love, the most difficult desire to control. It is also because Hindustani music was and still is designed to be at its best when performed in intimate spaces to a small group of aficionados, and because highly developed theories of reception and audience connoisseurship are central to its successful performance. The time and space dedicated to connoisseurship in Mughal India, and particularly to the patronage of musicians and reciters of poetry, was the Majlis, elsewhere called the Mehfil, the Bazam, the Jalsa, and so forth. Here I'm going to use Majlis because this is what it's most commonly referred to at this time. The Majlis was a highly scripted institution whose boundaries, values, transgressions, and delights were recorded widely in Mughal painting, poetry, and collections of biographies or tazkiras, which themselves were often conceived as fantasy majlises, or majalis, to use the correct plural. It was recollected after 1857 through a haze of nostalgia in novels and films, and survives in altered forms today as the musical mehfil and the poetical mushaira. I will use Andrews and Kalpakla's very useful knowledge of scripting pertaining to the Ottoman Majlis to help us read through representations of the Mughal Majlis for traces of the fleeting sensory and emotional experiences that patrons of music sought and tasted. The highly stereotypical rhetorical ways in which the live Majlis was pinned down in different media, its scripting, do not entirely place its lived experience beyond reach. Rather, the script was in constant dialogue with and was inserted into the repeated experiences of live majalis that Mughal and Rajput men enjoyed over their lifetimes as connoisseurs. Critically, the script replicates that back and forth. Through repetition that is never entirely identical, the script lingers on and deepens our understanding of those sensual and emotional qualities most valued by Mughal-era connoisseurs. But most importantly, its replication and constant repetition across various art forms and recollections shaped elite men's expectations of the musical majlis itself and taught them how to experience it. The script taught them how this temporary live assemblage of sensory, emotional, and social stimuli should feel. It's worth considering some instances of this script across media and forms from the 17th century. Two examples of the genre painting: the Convivial Gathering, circa 1600 to 05, considered to be portraits respectively of Akbar and his son Salim, later Jahangir, although this is somewhat disputed. An entry in Sheikh Farid Bukhari's Tazkira of Mughal officials from about 1649-50, an extract from the collection of tales The Bahar-e Danish, 1651, and verses by the Braj Pasha poet Vrind in 1691. Produced over nearly a century, these representations of connoisseur patrons and the Majlis demonstrate several continuities in elite social and cultural ideals. Indeed, there are hundreds of examples that express similar ideas about what pursuits and character traits were valued in elite men. Sheikh Farid Bukhari, an official in Shah Jahan's service, described Hussamuddin Khan as well known for his efficiency, understanding, learning, and perception. He is famous in the world for bravery, courage, and deliberation too. He is a well-spoken young man and has great physical strength. He is well versed in each branch of knowledge through his very frequent intercourse with learned men. His calligraphic writing is more manifest than the sun. In the art of music, he is second to Khaja Aqil and is without an equal in the extempore composition of poetry, witticism, and eloquence. Few will be found so fond of hunting as he. He is unique in the world in cherishing friends. The writer of this compendium, Sheikh Farid, is under obligation to him. Vrin's poetical description of his Mughal patron 50 years later couches his praise in Indic terms rather than Persianate ones. He was writing in Braj Pasha, but highlights strikingly similar qualities. He is handsome, steadfast, valiant, and skilled with a bow, generous, knowledgeable, an enjoyer, extremely generous in spirit. Mirza Qadiri is the jewel of his family, clever with emotion, experiencing delight, a connoisseur, a rasika. He understands matters of sentiment, ras, and pursues love wholeheartedly. He longs night and day for music and pleasure. Divided between skill in the arts of war and connoisseurship of the arts of pleasure, a number of things are valued here. The cultivation of courtly manners, elegant speech, knowledge, and understanding stemmed from the virtue of wisdom. Physical strength, steadfastness, bravery, and skill in the hunt and with the bow displayed the virtue of courage. Expertise in poetry, calligraphy, music, and witticism, generosity and the ability to taste pleasure and the emotions, and the knowledgeable patronage of poets, painters, and musicians, all of these were outworkings of the virtue of temperance. From other such records, to poetry, calligraphy, painting, and music, we can add expertise in the arcana of perfume, flowers, food, precious stones and metals, fine textiles, and youthful male beauty. These objects of connoisseurship appear widely in the genre of painting often called the convivial gathering, as symbols of the cultivated man, the ideal prince. Mughal painting of this period was iconic. What was valued was not unfettered novelty, but the virtuosity with which a painter rendered and combined traditional compositions, themes, and symbols. The composition of both these paintings is very close. Events take place beneath the open sky in a semi-formal garden, part overgrown with lush greenery and wildflowers. Its waterways and fountains a haven for mating pairs of deer and ducks. The central and socially most elevated figure, the patron, is seated under a canopy on a platform or chair placed on an exquisitely detailed carpet, its floral designs drawing the garden into the semi-interior space. On the far side, on the right, a servant holds the patron's sword, wrapped in red cloth, a symbol of his status and duty, but for the moment held in abeyance. The patron's attention is captured by a beautiful younger man, with whom he shares the intimacy of commensality, a shared wine cup, a delicacy offered, an embrace. In the painting of Salim, a young poet holds his book, ready to recite from it. In both, musicians suffuse the scene with melody. It's worth noting that Salim's musicians on the left are Hindustani Kalawans singing Drupad, accompanied by the Rudravina, while Akbar's, on the right, play the Persian spike fiddle, the gachak, and the end-blown flute, the nai. Details may be changed according to the artist's fancy and intent, but the sound of music must ever fill the painted world. Music, wine, and poetry, and beautiful young men turn out to be objects of connoisseurship par excellence in Mughal-era texts and painting, and were often enjoyed together in the majlis. Such a gathering is described thus in the Bahar-e-Danish. The shouts of pleasure and rejoicing reached the extremities of the globe. The wine of gladness sparkled in the goblet of congratulation, and the sprightly melody of lively airs from the lute eased the mind of care. In every apartment they strewed a variety of flowers and sweet-scented herbs, and mixed together whole bags of the musk of asfir and essences of ambergris to regale the senses of the joyous assembly. Fascinating vocal performers chanted mirthful strains, and magic-sounding musicians like Venus drew forth the notes of delight. Jasmine-faced cupbearers with ruby-coloured wine gave zest and brilliancy to the assemblage of pleasure, and smiling flower-bearers with their varied attitudes drew the hearts of beholders into the snares of their tangled tresses. Wine, music, fresh flowers, perfume, youthful beauty, and the promise of pleasures to come. They may be stereotypical, but as script, they signify joy, delight, love, and desire, leading to ecstatic fulfillment in the transient moment. How? According to the philosopher Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, The love of God is the highest of all topics. We come now to treat of love in its essential nature. Love may be defined as an inclination to that which is pleasant. This is apparent in the case of the five senses, each of which may be said to love that which gives it delight. Thus the eye loves beautiful forms, the ear, music, etc. But there is a sixth sense, or faculty of perception, implanted in the heart, through which we become aware of spiritual beauty and excellence. Thus a man who is only acquainted with sensuous delights cannot understand what the prophet meant when he said he loved prayer more than perfumes or women, though the last two were also pleasant to him. Following this, Mughal writers viewed wine, music, perfume, beauty, and physical union as the manifestation of the power of desire as it pertained to the five senses: taste, hearing, smell, sight, and touch. In the words of Abul Fazl, the magical Nairangi, Jadu, power of music, caused the beautiful creatures of the harem of the heart to shine forth on the tongue. The melodies then enter through the window of the ear and return to their former seat, the heart, bringing with them thousands of presents. The hearers, according to their insight, are moved to sorrow or to joy. Music is thus of use to those who have renounced the world and to such as still cling to it. Music was thus a direct vehicle of human and divine beauty, desire, love, longing, and sorrow to the listener, with unmediated access to his soul and the power to transform his emotional state, generally to beneficial effect, tasir or asar. Words used most commonly in Mughal era literature for music's effects are those for pleasure and delight, with lots of nuances: haz, khush, surur, zoq, shauq, lazzat, nishad, nimet, dilchasp, dilruba, and lots of other heart words, or those for sorrow, pain, and separation, especially hazin, dard, and firaq. To preeminent music connoisseur Fakhrullah Saif Khan, writing in 1666, the arousal of tender sympathy in the heart was both what music is, its very essence, and its result. And the job of musicians in the majlis, as Dargah Quli Khan pointed out, was to steal hearts or to wound them. What is most interesting, though, about these scripted sensory objects of desire is that all of them are perishable. The beauty of poetry was much more in the sound of its recitation than its calligraphic form. These objects' principal beauty and worthiness of connoisseurship lay in their experience in the moment, in the tasting of their intense but fleeting sensory and emotional flavor. Indeed, their momentary presence in the world heightens and draws attention to the primary emotion the majlis was designed to explore: the poignancy of transience, the double-edged sword of delight in love found and grief in its inevitable loss. But the other great Mughal value on display in these depictions is affection, the value of male friendship. The phrase Bukhari uses repeatedly in his praise of commendable men is "he was known for cherishing friends." In perusing the biographical literature, it becomes clear that in the Mughal world, connoisseurship of the arts, crafts, and sensual experiences was inseparable from a highly cultivated ethic of male friendship that went way beyond conviviality. In a volatile political situation, there were few bonds that guaranteed loyalty. Ideally, the ties of kinship should do that, but historical chronicles show that biological, milk, and marital bonds were regularly betrayed. More steadfast and revered than any of these bonds, if one were lucky enough to find it, was the friendship of a trusted companion. Legendary friendships, such as that of Mahmud al-Ghazni and his slave Ayaz, were held up in poetry as the ideal of Mughal relationships. Other less exalted relationships were celebrated in tazkiras, like the mutual devotion of Fakhrullah and the famous poet Nasir Ali. Such intense friendships were common between Mughal men of similar status. The mahabbat or dosti between two men was regarded as the most powerful human bond because it was chosen on the basis of spiritual sympathy and shared interests. Babur's cousin, Mirza Haider, in explaining why he rejected the duty of a closer blood tie to fight for Humayun in 1540, wrote, "Now the Emperor Humayun and myself had become friends after the Mughal fashion, and he had given me the name of Dust. In council, he never addressed me by any other name, and on imperial orders, it was written in this manner. No one of my brothers or the sultans of the time who had been in the emperor's service had ever been honored in such a way as was I, Mirza Haider, who, being the approved friend of such a prince as the emperor, was called not merely brother, but was chosen as Dost." And we did need to give him a little bit of liberty for probably some hyperbole here. In music, intimate friendship and connoisseurship went hand in hand. It's clear from the canonical musical literature of the 1660s to 90s that friendship was central to its production and reception. The primary stated audience for music treatises was the author's friends, and only secondarily, if at all, performers. Treatises likewise circulated through the wider friendship network of patron connoisseurs. With one exception, Aurangzeb's chief Kalawant, Rasparas Khan. All of the writers of these texts were Mirzas of rank in Mughal service. Fakhrullah directs his statements consistently towards connoisseurs. That his audience was intended to be fellow travellers of his own class, as opposed to professional musicians, is indicated by the known readership of his musical treatise, the Rag Darpan. Speaking of his faulty first draft, which was about 1664, he wrote, "It so happened that some of my friends whose entire pleasure, Zauq, is in music, came and insisted upon having a copy of the first draft. To any of my friends, Dust, and to all men of discernment who are in possession of the first draft, a humble request is made to discard it." In short, the intended audience for his writing was his intimates and other like-minded patrons. As one of Aurangzeb's top 150 mansabdars, the likelihood that Fakhrullah pursued friendships with professional Hindustani musicians is remote. Professionals all belonged to low-status hereditary qawms that writers explicitly set apart from the Zat-i-Sharif, the respectable classes, according to Mirza Khan, writing in 1675. These musical treatises were written by high-ranking patron connoisseurs for their intimates and other connoisseurs of elite rank, and thereby comrades in the quest for manly perfection. Indeed, the social context in which this rash of new musical writing appeared maps directly onto real friendship networks that can be traced through contemporaneous bibliographical writings, tazkiras. So, on the one hand, the script for the majlis or mehfil, elaborated in these paintings and texts, emphasizes the importance of a cultivated appreciation of transient things and sensual experiences, notably music and recited poetry, as key to being a perfected man. On the other, it emphasizes the circles of affection and friendship between men in which this appreciation occurred. More than that, in which friendship was also cultivated and appreciated as a manly virtue. How then did the connoisseurship of music work in the majlis to control and make virtuous the domain of pleasure, thereby both demonstrating a man's mastery of reason and reinforcing that most important of Mughal virtues, affection between friends? Because music possessed power, and because that power activated desire in the listener, if not very carefully controlled, music could unbalance the listener's equilibrium, unleashing his desires and potentially wreaking moral havoc. The Anwari Saheli put this destructive potential in the terms of the akhlaq literature, using the same horse and rider imagery as Abul Fazl, but this time with music destabilizing the king. And I quote, "A king had a musician of a pleasant voice and a sweet performer who, by his enchanting melodies, bore the foot of reason out of the stirrup and wrested the reins of self-possession from the hand of patience and endurance." Cautionary tales about courtiers and kings who become so lost in listening to music that they neglected their duties as rulers and thereby suffered the loss of their lands and even their lives are so prevalent in Mughal literature as to constitute a standard rhetorical topos. And this forms the basis of my article, The Courtesan Tale. So carefully did music have to be handled that musicians themselves were considered of very dubious status in prescriptive literature, to be separated as far as possible from men of virtue. "Take care of the pen striker and sword striker," says Sadi in his Bustan, "not the musician, for manliness comes not from the string striker. This is not manliness, but the enemy in the affairs of war, thou, confused with the wine cup and sound of the harp." Dawani notes, that a man should not be friends with someone whose passion for amusement and diversion, particularly to listening to music and the intimacy of musicians, interferes with his feeling for a genuine friend. If so, no wish should be entertained for his attachment. It is worth noting that the ethical literature and cautionary tales do not denigrate listening to music per se. Rather, they criticize excessive attachment to music and friendship with musicians, an attitude sometimes even expressed by notorious pleasure seekers like Darga Quli Khan, who lavishly documented Delhi's elite majalis in about 1740. The attempt to reinforce musicians' low status through shunning friendship with them was paralleled during the majlis itself by moves to rein in musicians' sonic powers over elite listeners. Indeed, much of the highly technical knowledge found in Mughal music treatises might be considered to constitute intellectual controls put in place in the etiquette of connoisseurship to harness the power of music, first to control it and then to wield it. The fundamental job of the musician in the majlis was to arouse pleasure and delight in listeners through both beauty of voice and the melodies performed. Notably, Mirza Khan particularly commended singers whose voices could produce contentment, pleasure, and sweet delight in the heart, or possess such sorrow that the singer's fingernails scratch the heart and listening to them arouses tender sympathy. These effects could only happen, however, if the musicians achieved perfection in his or her performance of the Hindustani rags, each one a highly complex melodic formula that, when deployed perfectly at its exact prescribed time, produces a particular emotional effect, tasir. What the patron required was ilm, knowledge, ilmi musiqi, the music technical knowledge exclusive to connoisseurs and professional musicians, and ilmi majlis, the implicit rules of taste and conduct for the musical gathering. All the Aurangzeb era treatises are presented as written repositories of this precise knowledge for the patron, so that, and I quote, listeners who do not know this art can learn from this book, in order that in the musical assembly, musicians and others who have the stamp of genius are not put to shame, and the connoisseurs of music do not find fault with them. And that's from the Miftah al-Sarod, 1664. In other words, so the patron could bring the wild strains of melody under the subjection of the rules of musiqi and majlis, and thus prove in an external action before his social peers his ability to place his own desire under rational control. The onus was on the patron and his listening companions to be in complete control of musical proceedings in the majlis. And the ilm, knowledge, they wielded was largely aimed at controlling the power of the base passions over the assembled company, represented either in the person of the performer or in what was performed and how. Patrons themselves should rarely sing, excuse me, lest they be mistaken for a professional. Only unimpeachable musicians from the Qawms, already noted, that enjoyed imperial patronage were supposed to enter the elite majlis. Performers whose usual domain was the women's quarter, the bazaar, or the village most certainly were not, or not without scandal, because it did happen from time to time. And it certainly happened more often in the 18th and 19th centuries. What and how they sang also mattered. It was best to stick to those canonical genres created by the masters of old, whose authority was universally recognized. Performers should never make a mistake. Every melodic phrase must be strong and sweet, in tune, in time, under complete breath control, and thus perfectly create the form of the rag. But patrons should also only employ singers with clear and correct pronunciation, intelligence, control, and authority, a calm and modest demeanor, and an open, attractive face. Musicians who sang through gritted teeth or with mouth so wide you could see down their gullets were abhorrent, as were those who closed their eyes, breathed too often, trembled all over, waved their limbs about, extended and retracted their necks like camels, puffed out their cheeks like pumpkins, strained so hard their forehead and neck veins stood out, or sang with the detestable tone of a crow, an ass, a wild camel, or a she-goat. But if the patron possessed the ilm of the connoisseur, he could control the musical assembly and bend music's affective powers to his will. Control began with appointing the right musicians. Those who had mastered the ilm majlis as well as ilm musiqi, belonged to an authentic musical lineage, tariqa, silsila, generally from the Kalawant or Qawwal communities, had learned from a perfect master, Ustadi Kamil, and whose singing conformed with the established canons and traditions, Zabita and Qawanin. This was the minimum guarantee of proper training and unwavering command over voice, bodily comportment, and full musical materials, including rag, tal, and the ability to compose and perform song genres. The prescriptions for creating a beautiful voice in the Tofar al-Hind are physiologically precise. To create a voice that was strong, creamy, sustained, agile, and clean in all registers and speeds, without distorting face or body, would have required years of practical training and full mastery of vocal technique, breath control, and the extraordinary mental arithmetic required to extemporize melody flawlessly on the spot. Such ingredients produced a near disembodied performer perfectly in control of his or her musical materials, and thus able to act as an unpolluted channel of the power of the rags to the ears of listeners. Once under control, music's acknowledged power over the emotions could then be wielded to beneficial effect. Musical sound was such a potent force in the struggle between reason and emotion because it could, it was believed, deliver both. Music was the sonic vehicle of desire, but it was also a key source of adalat, and as such could strengthen the rational mind and generate courage or temperance, or produce equilibrium in the bodily humours. This was because music's powers were rooted in the Greco-Islamic exact sciences, in astrology, and in the mathematics underpinning musical acoustics, which exact scientists had tied together across Eurasia since Pythagoras. And music is what Jalaluddin Davani used as his primary proof of the scientific basis of adalat and of the theory the four cardinal virtues of virtuous means between extremes of excess and insufficient exertion of the powers. Right in the middle of the Akhlaq-i Jalali is an extended treatise on music theory, which establishes mathematically the Pythagorean acoustical method of tuning the 12 notes of the scale. Because music, alone among the arts, is rationally based in mathematical ratios. This is true, by the way. The harmonious functioning of musical acoustics was mathematical proof of the scientific basis of equilibrium in general. In order to bring balance to the powers of mind, musicians were enjoined to manipulate the parameter of tempo, speed. As was very clear to people of taste, fast tempi awakened the powers of desire and anger, whereas slow tempi induced sorrow or existential states that strengthened the power of inner perception, nazar. Hindustani music's most important powers, though, concerned the efficacy of the rags to cure imbalances of the bodily humours. Each rag was considered to generate a unique affective essence, or rasa, capable of arousing specific emotions in the listener. Mughal music theorists explained the rag's emotional essence as resulting from the elemental effects of the 7 swaras, notes, sa, re, ga, ma, pa, dha, ni, on the 4 humours of the listening body. And just as in Davani's musical proof of adalat, they argued these powers derived from the movement of the 7 celestial bodies through the 12 houses of the zodiac. In their choice of rags to be performed in the majlis, then, patrons and musicians had to be acutely sensitive to the time and atmosphere of the occasion and the temperamental mood of the connoisseurs, deploying rags that would regulate listeners' imbalances and bring their humours back into equilibrium. As Abul Fazl put it, to ease the cares of worldly duties and restore the faculties. According to Rasparas Khan, the great-great-grandson of Akbar's famous court musician Tansen and chief of Aurangzeb's musicians, this was why rags, with dominant cold notes, should be played at midday. He was writing in 1698. In order to balance out the heat of the day, and watery rags be sung in the hot, dry months, in order to precipitate the monsoon rains. Similarly, a melancholic patron could have his cold, dry humour balanced out by listening to rags that emphasized hot and wet notes, thus restoring his equilibrium and making him fit again to take up sword and pen. The Mughal Majlis and the musical performance and knowledgeable listening that took place within it was a major public arena in which Mughal patrons performed the inner struggle to place desire under rational control, with music itself an indispensable and active agent in this effort. But the most critical connection between music and the political order in these texts was the correlation that Rasbaras Khan, Ahobala Pandit, and Mirza Roshan Zamir, respectively Aurangzeb's chief hereditary musician, a seminal Sanskrit theorist, and a major Mughal patron and connoisseur, made between the seven swaras and the social hierarchy of their day. In Rasbaras Khan's orally transmitted system, the fiery notes are Rajputs, the watery notes are Brahmins, the scholarly and priestly caste, the airy notes represent castes, and the earthy notes are lower caste agriculturalists. Strikingly, this is virtually the same correlation that Abul Fazl made regarding the four ranks of the Mughal polity: the rulers and nobility are fiery, the scholars and philosophers watery, the scribes and chancellery airy, and servants earthy. In other words, the theory of equilibrium dictating his Hindustani musical performance was identical to the theory of equilibrium underpinning Abul Fazl's notion of the body politic. Music, and by extension the entire domain of pleasure and connoisseurship, was thus an essential element in the maintenance of the whole structure of empire, not only of self-governance amongst affectionate friends, but political governance from the emperor downwards. This is the primary reason that music features so prominently as a symbol of auspiciousness and dynastic celebration, from the daily sounding of the Nobat ensemble to major state occasions like coronations and royal births, in the historical accounts of all the Mughal emperors, including Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb and lesser patrons may sometimes have renounced music personally, but no one could remove music from Mughal life, even if they wished to, because music and the domain of pleasure, rationally controlled, was absolutely necessary to maintaining the justice, equilibrium, health, and well-being of the body politic. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much. It was a fascinating lecture, no doubt. I mean, the way you described not only what music was to the Mughals, but also tried to explain why Aurangzeb could not do away with it. I would like to take up certain questions which have been put up for you. I'll just scroll through them and well, there is a question by Zainab Dakwi. First of all, she thanks you for a very intriguing lecture.
Thank you.
And then she said that you had, in fact, said that in your article on that did Aurangzeb ban music or not, that Manuchi and Khafi Khan sources are not reliable. So she wants to know, and she says that the fact that decline did not take place in the patronage of music under Aurangzeb. So have you anything more to add to that? Why we should not actually rely on Manuchi and Khafi Khan? Was there any sort of real decline in the court or not? Because we do know that there are certain sources which stop mentioning music after Manuchi and after Khafi Khan says that it was banned, although all of us agree with you that actually happened. So can you satisfy Zainab the question which she's asking?
Sure. Thank you so much for that lovely question, Zainab, and it's my pleasure to answer it. So it is quite confusing, of course, because I was Katherine Butler Brown before, and so I'm now Katherine Schofield, and I haven't changed my mind. So I think it's important to recognize not so much that Manuchi and Khafi Khan are unreliable, although Manuchi certainly is, more that we misunderstand them and take them far too literally. especially when you consider the uses to which rhetoric about music and musical stories are placed in both European writing and in Persian writing on music. So music frequently appears in Mughal historical chronicles, in stories that are usually about something else. And one of the classic stories is music comes into the story when an author is trying to find a reason something to blame the downfall of a courtier on. And this is true even of a character like Najaf Khan, Shah Alam II's great general, who William Dalrymple has written about his death scene so beautifully in his new book, The Anarchy. And the authors try to blame his illness on far too much consorting with courtesans and so on. There's really, he had a disease. It had nothing to do with listening to too much music. But this is a topos, and for Aurangzeb, who, as we know, said that music was a neutral activity, neither good nor bad. For him, he couldn't listen to it because it was too much of a distraction for him. But let's set those sources aside and just look at other sources. So we just have so many sources that write about people listening to music from both European and Persian sources, listening to all sorts of music, watching all sorts of kinds of dance, and we have lots and lots of paintings from this era as well, which depict music and dance. So just taking the period that we know Aurangzeb wasn't listening to music, or believe that he wasn't listening to music. We don't know if he started listening again privately. We just don't know. But between 1668 and 1707, lots and lots of things. We know too that music treatises were being circulated. New copies were being produced in this period. So that beautiful copy of the Miftah al-Sarud, which I showed you, this treatise was originally written in 1664 for Aurangzeb. It's dedicated to him. We don't know if he ever got it or not, although you were not supposed to say it was dedicated to the emperor unless the emperor actually allowed you to. But this particular copy is from 1691, and it's from the Deccan. It was produced in the Deccan with these absolutely beautiful illustrations of the raga. We don't know exactly who owned it, but it was certainly in the Deccan while Aurangzeb was fighting in the Deccan, probably, a member of his army who owned this and had this written out and illustrated for him in Aurangzeb's camp, perhaps. We don't know for certain. There's also a copy of Mirza Roshan Zamir's masterful work, these Tarjome Parijatak, which is his translation of Ahobala's Sangita Parijata. Absolutely brilliant work, both of them, both the Sanskrit and the Persian, which was produced, rewritten for somebody in 1688. It's a very nicely written copy, very clear, no illustrations, clearly designed as a vehicle for knowledge for somebody. So that's just those two things. We also have the evidence of Rasbar Khan Kalawand himself, who is the descendant of the great Tansen, in the direct lineage, writing his own treatise for Aurangzeb in 1698. But there are just lots. It's completely impossible that music stopped. One of the best examples, actually, is Aurangzeb's son, Muhammad Azam Shah, who was 15 in 1668 and died in 1707. So his entire career as a connoisseur coincided with the supposed ban. And he was the first patron, of course, of the great Persian poet Bedil. And depending on how you pronounce it in slightly differently in India and Iran. And he was also the first patron of Sadarangji, the great 18th century musician who died in 1747. As a young man, he was a Drupad singer and a bean player, and studied khayal with some qawwals in the entourage of Muhammad Azam Shah. But Muhammad Azam Shah also himself composed khayal compositions. I have no idea whether there are any still in the repertoire, probably not. And we know who he composed them for as well. He composed them for his best friend, the grandson of Shaista Khan. So these stories, sort of date immediately after Aurangzeb dies. So, there's no sense in any of the literature until almost the middle of the 19th century, in Persian anyway, that Aurangzeb banned music. The first time, to my knowledge, that this story appears in Persian writing on Hindustani music is in the 1830s, I think. In the I don't want to give you the wrong information, but it's certainly the 19th century. Before that, this is not a story. There's also a collection of Drupad compositions in each of the ragas with beautiful illustrations of Drupad of each of the ragas as Ragamala paintings in Yale University, and dating from about 1720, and each one of these Drupad compositions is dedicated to Aurangzeb.
You're quite correct. But related to that is another question, and that is that there are certain historians who believe and tell that even Aurangzeb himself not only loved music but also made music. It is alleged that he was a veena player himself. So, what have you to say on that?
I mean, so I have not come across any direct information about that myself. There is that very famous painting of him, which is in the St. Petersburg album, painted by Hanhar, called, which we call in English, Aurangzeb in a Shaft of Light. And one of the accoutrements of the two servants who are sitting just outside his shaft of light is a Rudravina. And whether that indicates his love of music, or whether that indicates that it was himself, he perhaps played it, I don't know. What is true is that although Mughal noblemen were strictly strictly not supposed to perform in public, they could sing but not play anything else, unless in case they got mistaken for a professional musician, which would have been lowering to their status. Some of them did actually study Hindustani music quite seriously. So Fakhr Saif Khan, for example, himself created some mixed ragas of his own. So he must have been quite proficient. And we know that Mirza Roshan Zamir was a student of Khushal Khan Kalawant, who was Rasbaraz Khan Kalawant's father, and that he himself composed khayal compositions. So they're certainly composing, and of course that means they are doing it physically. They're not just writing them down, because the performed tradition is an oral tradition. So it's certainly possible. I just haven't found any evidence that he did. He certainly knew a lot.
Right. There are a number of questions which have been asked. For example, there are two questions by Lubna. Lubna Irfan, who is a lecturer at Aligarh. She says, we see that there is some sort of continuity from Akbar to Jahangir's time, and we have seen what Aurangzeb's attitude was towards music. How do we look at Shah Jahan's patronage? Did his assertion of Timurid lineage cause a discontinuity from his predecessors? This is the first question which she puts up to you. There is another question which has been put up by her. She wants to ask about the music and performance in more non-regulated popular spaces. What could be the sources to explore those, and how can we reconstruct that past?
Thank you so much, Lubnaji. They are just the excellent questions. So the first thing about Shah Jahan's reign, and this is actually quite exciting. One of the problems is that there's always appeared to be a gap in musicological writing in ilm musiqi, not so much Sangeeta Shastra, but in Persian writing on Hindustani music, between the classic formulation and the chapter on Sangeet and then instruments and then types of singers in Abul Fazl's Aini Akbari, which is why I start my lecture with 1593. And then the period of Aurangzeb Alamgir. So we get this fantastic collection of 1,000 Drupads, which were collected together, all of them written by Nag Bakshu, the great musician of the early 16th century, who was writing them for the Sultan of Gujarat and the Sultan of Gwalior. And the work of Nalini Dalwar, the great music scholar, particularly of Braj Pasha sources, has pointed out that some of the earlier texts preserve the initials of the original patrons, but replace their names with Shah Jahan. So Shah Jahan is is taking Drupads that were written for somebody else and saying, these are now mine, and he's canonizing them, putting them all together and selecting them. So it's a selective process of selecting the best ones, the most authentic ones, and putting them all together in this kind of canonizing move. So the move towards a kind of a Mughal systematization of musical knowledge is really starting in Shah Jahan's reign. But there's not a lot in Persian. So there is a preface in Persian to that collection of Braj Pasha songs. What's really exciting is the work of Richard David Williams at SOAS, who has been working on the Braj Pasha material and has been finding all sorts of treatises in Braj Pasha, including one by the daughter of Abdul Rahim Khani Khanan, which is really amazing. And a couple of others that are known from later scholarship to have been written at that time. And of course, there's a considerable amount of writing in Sanskrit and Braj Pasha for the Mughal emperors on music in this period. So Hari Vallabh, who is famous for his Braj Pasha translation of the Sanskrit treatise, the Sangeeta Darpana, which is also a 17th century Sanskrit text, very early 17th century. There's been rumors that it was made for Jahangir, but we don't really know that for sure. But there's a Braj Pasha translation by Hari Vallabh in the first part of the 17th century during the reign of Shah Jahan, which then becomes really important for the painter's tradition of painting Ragamala paintings, because it's full of these beautiful, exquisite Braj Pasha verses for each of the ragas and raganis. So watch this space. It's also possible that a treatise that I thought was slightly later, but which is by a Kaval, may have been written, I don't know, at the end of Shah Jahan's reign as well, rather than later. But most of the bulk of the kind of systematic writing is in the late 17th century. So at the moment, I think this is a case of we need to look rather than there's nothing there. The second question is fantastic. So there are, of course, a plethora of musicians that in the British Museum, or now British Library, Mirzanama, which is about 1660, the author says you shouldn't listen to if you want to be recognized as being a proper Mirza. Mostly rural musicians, bazaar musicians, and musicians associated with the women, with women's celebrations and so on. But some of this information can be got at through looking at different types of what one might call, as a placeholder, ethnographic writing. So writing about Qom and Jat. There's a section in the Ain Akbari where he talks about all the different communities of musicians and describes them. And a number of those musicians are not musicians who the later treatises say are allowed to go into the elite mehfil. They don't sing in Rag or Ragni. They or Tal. They sing folk genres, they sing war genres. And there, it turns out that there are long-standing topoi for painting these musicians, these groups of musicians as well. So if you look at a community like the Bazigar, who are conjurers, but who also play the pungi in order to bring the in order to bring the snakes out of the basket and so on. There's a little entry in on them, I think, in the Ain Akbari. There certainly are in later kind of descendants of this text, and there are paintings of them that are almost identical, going back to the earliest I found is in the background of a painting of the shrine of Hazrat Moinuddin Chishti at Ajmer from the mid-17th century. So that kind of information is there. But you can also look through historical chronicles and paintings for what I've been calling noisy moments. So if you have a look at paintings of celebrations in particular, and some of Bonnie Wade's work picks up on some of these perhaps non-canonical, non-elite musicians, like the players of the huruk, who are auspicious but not meant to play in the, raga and the mehfil. But that's not what they do. But she's identified some of them, in the sort of the bottoms of paintings and things like that. So that's where to look for that kind of material, and also in poetry, particularly the city disturber genre, the Shehrashob genre, and especially satirical poetry. So there's there's a lot there. But you're looking at different types of literature than looking at music treatises for those, by and large. So.
Right. Well, there is a question by Dr. Zoya Zedi. She is basically, a physician, a doctor, interested in literature and history. And she asks, when music is so powerful a medium of control of finer senses, producing equilibrium in the body and mind, transcending the self and elevating the human soul to a higher level, how did it become so much of a no letter in Islam?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thank you. Essentially, it has always been a matter of controversy in Islamic jurisprudence. So you get a lot of tracts throughout this period which are on the permissibility of sama, so listening, audition, and of course in this context it's on the legitimacy of sama in the spiritual context. So should you be listening to songs in the Sufi dargah? Should you be, if you are listening to songs, should they be accompanied by instruments? Should they be accompanied by drums? And those kinds of questions. And they come for or against. And a lot of the introductions to the music treatises will have a bit of this argy-bargy in the introduction. But it's always been regarded, as Aurangzeb said, as mubah. So neutral, neither good nor bad. What makes it good or bad is how it is used. So there's Al-Ghazali is the place to go for this, and his writings were actually very, very influential on Mughal thinking and on music as well. And he talks about ikhwan, zaman, and makan. That is to say, company, time, and place. If the company and the time and the place are all respectable and respectful, then, and the content of the music is not disgusting or rude, then it's permissible. If one of those things is off, so if you are missing Friday prayers to have a mehfil, then that's a problem. That shouldn't happen. But there are good times for these things. So it's actually about disposition of company, time, and space here. But it's also worth noting that many, there's a whole spectrum of opinion on this. And of course, all of the musicians, the hereditary musicians at this time were themselves Muslims. Apart from, interestingly, Pakawach players tended to be Hindu. I'm not entirely sure why, but certainly singers and string players. It's very complicated. But the answer is it's not forbidden. It's a certain group of people who've decided that that's what they're going to say.
Well, another question to you by Sagnik Sarkar. Despite the dubious social status of musicians, as you have pointed out, the potential of music and pompous debauchery in destabilizing the political, military, and administrative acumen of the empire, how did Aurangzeb, the epitome of this idea, become a Veena player himself? I think you have answered this question, but how do we reconcile this contradiction with, he says, secondly, does Abbasid era Al-Farabi's concept of an ideal Islamic philosopher king with his extensive work on importance of music, Kitab al-Musiq al-Kabir, have any influence on musical patronage and musical education of Mughal royalty?
Again, I have never had such good questions, I have to say. These are just absolutely brilliant. All of these questions that everybody's asked so far. So on Al-Farabi and on the tradition of musical philosophy, which comes originally from Greek philosophy and then is interpreted in Arabic in the first few centuries of Islam, and then into Persian, and frequently sort of translated by the same authors from Arabic into Persian and vice versa. So Al-Farabi being one of these incredibly important writers on music. A lot of these ideas are actually distilled into Persian writing on Hindustani music. So all of the material about the Pythagorean and the Platonic music of the spheres, let's get really technical. So the idea that you have a string, and if you split it exactly in half, you get sa, and then you get sa, exactly halfway along the string. If you put your finger exactly a third of the way along the string, you get sa, ba, right? So you can actually work out where each of the notes of the scale goes using quite simple fractions. This was first worked out by Pythagoras, and then Plato enfolds this into this idea that the 7 principal notes of the scale are attached to the 7 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye. And so therefore it becomes part of Islamic exact sciences, and this idea gets transferred straight over into Mughal, and earlier than that in Bijapur as well, so elsewhere, trying to explain why the ragas have to be played at particular times of the day and seasons of the year. It's worth noting that these ideas of time of day and season of the year predate the Persian writings, and that they do have Sanskrit explanations, but this is the Persianate explanation of what's going on. And it's also by the High Mughal period, the Pythagorean means of tuning the scale, especially along a single string as opposed to across strings in perfect fifths and fourths, is being written about and accepted in Sanskrit treatises as well. And we just need to remember it's not a religious thing. This is a technical thing. It's pure mathematics and astrology, which was shared sciences, and the humoral connections were also shared. So it's quite likely that these ideas actually predate this new systematization. It just happens to be that it's affine, so it's coming in from West Asia, and there's a number of other elements in Persian writing on Hindustani music going into the 18th century, and particularly in the revolution that happens with Tal in the late 18th century, where the old Sanskrit modes they've used to describe Tal just no longer work. It's for the Tals that have appeared by the end of the 18th century. It's much more equal numbers of sections of Tal. It's much more dance-based. And they say, right, well, we're going to look at Al-Kindi, and we are going to use Al-Kindi. And here's the way he describes Tal, rhythmic cycles, usul, actually, to describe Tal for the first time. So this is actually about appropriating models that work technically for acoustic phenomenon that are then associated with astrology, which was again regarded as an exact science. And it was in Europe too. You know, the idea that astrology was superstitious nonsense really only starts in the 18th century everywhere. Just to disclaimer, I don't believe in astrology, but I know many people who do. So, yeah, I think I should probably see if there's another question actually.
Yeah, but
great picture.
Someone, Sudhir Pandeyji asks you a question.
Gee.
There is no reference.
Oh, you've disappeared. Hello? Hello? Have you lost me?
No, looks like we've lost Professor Razavi for a bit. I'm going to take up another question in the meantime, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a question by Chandrasekhar Tampi. I read your article on Sophia Plowden while researching on Tawayefs. Was she successful in her efforts in not converting music, but rather in popularizing it in the West? When and why did Indian music lose favor amongst the English in India? Given we have painting and accounts of Kirkpatrick, Ochterlony, Skinner, and Fraser's as patrons of music and Notch, did it have to do with the changing dynamics of colonial rule, utilitarianism, etc.?
Thank you, Chandrasekhar. That's absolutely it. Yes. So her efforts at performing these. So for those of you who don't know, there's Sophia Plowden, who I've been writing about and have a podcast on, which is called The Courtesan and the Memsahib, was the wife of an East India Company officer in Lucknow, and she collected And in Western notation, the music and the lyrics in their original languages of a number, nearly 70 songs by a courtesan called Khanamjan. And we can actually use these diverse texts to actually perhaps put back together some of these songs as they may once have been performed. And I'm really hoping that between me and some professional Hindustani musicians, we might be able to do this. They'll never be the same. But what happened with them was that they then got published by a man called William Byrd in 1789 in Calcutta as these little keyboard pieces, and they became a huge hit amongst the colonizing British, not just in India, but also elsewhere in the British Empire, such as in the Straits settlements of Penang and later Singapore. And they actually kind of last as sort of a, salon pieces, would be played at parties, played and sung at parties, certainly among old India hands when they'd gone back to London and so on, for quite a while. And they start having new lyrics set to them. So there's lyrics by a woman called Mrs. Opie, who was actually quite a famous poet at the time in the very early 19th century. And they get turned into band arrangements and played at balls in Penang, and all sorts of slightly strange things like that. But it's never more than a kind of a cul-de-sac. You sort of get memories of the most famous of these songs, the Taza Ba Taza No Bano, which is the Ever Fresh and Ever New, the famous Hafez ghazal in Persian, appearing in lots of different descriptions of Nach and so on. In terms of how long English patronage of Hindustani music and dance lasted, there's quite a bit of evidence that some Europeans continued to appreciate and enjoy and sponsor Hindustani music throughout, but en masse, it's very much the kind of drive to anglicize things in the 1830s. There's a sort of much more of a sense that Nach is prostitution, particularly among as more people come out from England. They no longer have to engage with it. It's no longer the only music they have available to listen to. They have to engage with. They can engage with their own music much more often. So we actually see a turning of sympathy for Nach performance in about the 1830s. So you have it's still patronized by the officer of the regiment will be the guest of honor at a Nach and will still appreciate the dancing girls and so on, and it's mainly there for the entertainment of his soldiers, of course. And of course, all of these women are still there. They're often camp followers. So it's often in regimental settings that it's still appreciated. And particularly at major festivities like Dussehra. So, and happy Diwali to everybody celebrating. What really kills it is the uprising. So after 1857, there's this real kind of disgust. It's horrible, actually, disgust by Europeans at anything that smacks of mixing cultures. That becomes apparent in writing, in European writings. And this also feeds into, ideas about amongst the new patrons for Indian music, because of course what happens with the uprising with 1857 and 1858 is that if you kill lots of musicians and patrons in Delhi and Lucknow, which are still the major courts for the best music and dance at this time. If you kill lots of patrons and musicians, if they're all forced into exile, remembering that Muslims, and most of the musicians were Muslims, were forced out of Shah Jahanabad for 5 years after the uprising, and they're scattered all over the place, then you're going to have to make some really radical efforts to find new patrons and create new, and to make sure that the music survives. And of course, one of the means of doing this is to recalibrate for middle-class patrons who themselves are uncomfortable with the old ways and who are more fluent in modern Urdu and Hindi and Bengali, and some of them in English, than they are in Persian and Prajpasha and the old courtly languages. And so there's this real shift. And along with it, comes this baggage of you beginning to treat these very high status performers, courtesans particularly, as quote unquote prostitutes. And this is compounded by the 1864 Contagious Diseases Act, which lumps all the courtesans in with the prostitutes and says that they have to be inspected gynecologically every so often in order for them to keep working, which is pretty awful. Lots of the high class ones get around that, but nonetheless, so and then you get this kind of build up to a kind of an anti-Nautch movement amongst Indian middle classes by the 1890s. So it's a long way of saying your question, your suspicions are absolutely really spot on. So. Okay. Yeah. Are there some more questions?
Yes,
There
there are.
are lots of questions, actually.
Lots of questions. Shagufta, can you just tell me till where the questions have been taken? Well, there is a question by Chandrasekhar Tampi, which is there.
Yes.
I found your take on the grand piano in the hammam very interesting. The Ghusalkhana as a venue of sorries. Could you elaborate upon it?
Yeah, so this painting is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And I was alerted to it by Navina Haider, the curator there. And it is a painting. That's it. Thank you. It's a painting of an upright piano in the Ghusalkhana of the Red Fort, of the Lal Qila in Shah Jahanabad. And what's really cool about this painting is very hard to see, but behind the piano on the ledge there is a metronome. So somebody is learning to play the piano in this space and learning and perhaps practicing the piano in this space. So why exactly it's here, I don't know exactly. Although, of course, pianos and harpsichords are used very widely across India at this time. And we also have, beautiful descriptions of Indian musicians writing in Persian and later in Urdu about pianos and keyboards and how interesting they are. But what is the case is that the Ghusalkhana in Shah Jahanabad and in Agra was regularly used as a space for the emperor's most intimate gatherings for pleasure, particularly in winter. So there is a description from the 17th century of a performance of musicians and of women dancers for a dinner in the Ghusalkhana in Agra Fort, from one of the 17th century travelers who gets let up into the balcony behind the Jali screens so that he can watch. And in this assembly, the musicians are actually hidden outside. So the male musicians who are playing the accompanying instruments are outside, so they can't see, but they can be heard and they can hear. And so they play, and the women musicians come in, and it's just the emperor and his most intimate family who are present at this soiree. So the Ghosl is used as this kind of space, and it's also used. I mean, it's used in the in Shah Jahanabad as and even as a more private extension of the hall of private audience, as those of you who are Mughal historians will know anyway. And I have. So it seems as though this has long been a space for musical performance of the most intimate kind for the emperor and his intimates. And so the fact that there's a piano there is unsurprising in one sense, but also reflecting the fact that this really is a space that has been largely taken over by the British resident at this point. So, yeah. I want to find out more about the painting. Actually, this is
Well, I don't know whether you have answered this question by Chandrasekhar Tampi. I'm sorry, I missed your answers because of the internet issue at Aligarh. There were rains, and because of that, there's a disturbance. There's a question by Chandrasekhar Tampi. He says that I read your article on Sophia Plowden.
Yes, I did answer that one.
You did answer that. Yeah. Okay. Then Ehsanul Ehtisham has asked a question. While writing social history of sounds or music of early modern times, as we don't have recorded voices but texts and images, how we could write the history which is not essentially to cater the present needs? Well, we haven't met any of those historical figures either.
Yeah. No. Okay. So this actually gets to the heart of the dilemma of writing this kind of history. And this is the central conundrum of the book I'm writing at the moment, which is called Histories of the Ephemeral. It's currently called Histories of the Ephemeral. My potential publisher doesn't like the name of the book, but Histories of the Ephemeral, writing on music in late Mughal India. And it kind of bounces off Sheikh Khan Lodi, who in his Mirat al-Khayal, which is 1691, he says it is impossible to describe the essence of music in pen and ink on the surface of the page. All we are left with are the sibilant scratches of a broken pen. And that remains true before the era of sound recording. We only have very limited and mediated access to sound, and even with something like Sophia Plowden's Western notations of Hindustani songs, she didn't understand Hindustani music at all. She squeezed it into European terms, and so the actual sounds are gone. And besides, the vast bulk of performance of rag has always been improvised. It's always been unique. So once the last note has gone forever, it's gone forever. It's died. So this is the question. The central question of my book is, and putting it in Greek terms, is it possible for Orpheus to bring Eurydice back from the dead? So is it possible for somebody like me to, bring not just the sounds of the past, but how they were experienced back from those written sources? And the answer is no, it's not possible. What is possible, what is interesting then, is actually what we learn along the way in terms of doing that. And there are a lot of things that you can learn by looking at history through music and sound that you wouldn't necessarily see by looking at things in another way. But I'm also, so in my talk just now, I've talked about this concept that this aesthetic of the poignancy of transience, which the Mughals felt, which is their most cherished aesthetic, was this idea that you have to really enjoy the moment, the heavily sensory moment of music and perfume and beautiful food and beautiful flowers and nature and beautiful clothes and beautiful people all at once, and enjoy it in all its intensity. And what makes it even more poignant and even more intense is the fact that it's going to die, that it's temporary, and then once it's gone, it's gone. So they had the same sense. And so it's actually able to relate. That's then relatable. But there's also this idea that I've been talking about of scripting, and the fact that this moment, which is supposed to capture this transience, is repeated again and again and again across different media, slightly differently always. And that's there in a sense to train people how to feel as well. So there's that's one of the ways I'm trying to get at it. But it is, it's eternally frustrating. These things are mortal. They die. We can't access it. And that's why the advent of sound recording is also amazing, because all of a sudden you can hear what people are playing. So this last week with my students, I was talking about the type of writing on Rag Kamaj or Rag Kambawati from the Tofat el-Hind in 1675 right through to the present day, and how it's been represented. And all of a sudden in 1904, you get to Ustad Imdad Khan Saab's recording of Rag Kamaj, 3 minutes on the gramophone company, and all of a sudden you can actually hear the body. The body's there somehow. And it's just completely different. And then you realize everything you've been missing. So it's not really an answer. But, people keep writing about music, even though they can't answer this question. So there's something there.
There are so many questions. I don't know whether all of them should be put up to you or not. There is a question by Somrita Majumdar. Is there any evidence of listening to music in military camps? Did the Mughals take musicians with army in the time of war? And the second question she asks is about the regional patronage of music. How did Mughal court play a role in the spread of Hindustani music in North India and Bengal? Why didn't Hindustani musical schools become popular in South India?
That's a lot of questions, but they're also great. So yes, there's lots of evidence of music being performed in military camps. Lots of evidence of people taking their musicians with them. There's a great, speaking of Bengal, Mirza Natan, his great narrative memoir of him on expedition in Bengal with the Mughal army. And he talks about his own Kalawants coming with him and performing for various things, but he also uses them as go-betweens. He sends them as his agents to other courts and so on. But there's also lots of descriptions in Simon Digby's work on Sufi soldiers in the Deccan of musicians in Aurangzeb's camp playing. There's a great description by the
I think there is much information regarding that.
Yeah, there is. There's lots. Sorry.
I think he can read about it. There's much information. I think there was a question of Sudhir Pandey when my internet went off. Were you able to answer him? Because he's asking me. Well, he asked the question that when in astrology, or what did he ask? Just a moment. There is no reference of caste in Indian astrology. Where did you get the reference?
Okay, so this correlation of it's the notes of the scale to the to particular humors, and then to particular it's essentially to the full varnas, but when it's translated into Persian, it's slightly different. This is actually in Ahabala Pandit's Sanskrit treatise, the Sankita Parijata. So he does actually use this designation, but it really is a Persian thing. So it's specifically in relation to the use of astrology in music treatise, in Sangita Shastra, rather than in astrology generally. So this is about the application of astrology to music.
Right. I mean, there are a number of questions regarding certain ragas, which I think there is no time for answering for each separate rag. We can have a separate session on that.
I'd love to have a session on rag. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And I hope that we are able to organize that session.
That would be great.
Before we actually close, I would like to give certain of my comments, certain of my very basic queries. But before I start with that, let me request you, although more than 2 hours have gone by, 2 hours, 31 seconds, but still I would love if you could sing something for us in some rag or something. And but that would come after I have put up my queries. In fact, the first thing which I would like to say is that today, after hearing you, I was reminded of one of the very old Algerians who wrote on music. I mean, Dr. Balagat Hussain Shahab Sarmadi.
Ah, yes.
In fact, he was one of the first to start work on music.
Yeah.
And
the great pioneer.
Yeah, he was the pioneer, and I'm really thankful that while I was listening to you, I was reminded when you were telling us about the facts about the Mughals. I was reminded because I used to visit him sometime while he was ill. He would discuss those things with us. He had also written that very famous, Gurniatul Munnia, which he translated.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm really thankful for you for reminding us of.
Look, we are all following in his footsteps. He was the great pioneer, and I have the copy of his Rag Darpan, and mine is falling apart because I have used it so much.
I have heard that he had also written some other works also, but unfortunately, most of them are not available with us at Aligarh. So we are trying
to get them to you.
Yeah, we would really love to have them. Well, I have also, because I was working on professional middle classes under the Mughals, so I had a chapter on painters and musicians.
Oh, great.
In fact, today when you were talking about music, I found that there should also be a lecture on musicians themselves. What was their status? I would like to inform you that, there was a question regarding the status of the musicians, and the question was put up in a way as if the status of the musicians was quite lowly and not well. I would like to say that after having read the Mughal sources, the architects are not mentioned by name. Architects are only mentioned by their, general titles and adjectives. Whereas Abul Fazl supplies us with the individual names of the artists, these musicians. We know who they were. Sometimes, as you pointed out about Tansen or, for example, Bakshu, and there are certain others about whom we also have some information. So it appears that the status of the musicians, I don't know what it was in the ancient period. But as far as the Mughal court was concerned, they did enjoy a special status where they were given respectability. And that is whatever little I have studied for that chapter, that makes me say so. Secondly, I would like to point out that there were many types of musicians which were there during the 17th century. You are well aware of them. There were painters, there were musicians who were in the imperial service. There were painters who were in the ateliers of the nobles, and then there were painters whom I would call as, I'm again using the term painter, it's the musician. We had the Bazaar musicians. And there was a question about how to study about them. As you rightly pointed out, there are lots of miniatures. There are bazaar scenes. There are village scenes where music is being shown, made by these individual musicians. How in a village scene, there are a number of musicians playing music, playing instruments or singing, and a number of Dehkans, villagers, sitting and listening to them. So there are, it would be very interesting if one could dissect all these categories, because even in the imperial, those who were, recruited by the imperial authority, the musicians, even they were of two types. One who were part of the ensemble in the Karkhana, playing a typical type of music. Then there were those who were playing music within the court during the festivities which were taking place, and different type of musics being played by them. So that is something which would interest the students of history. While going through the material which is there in the Persian sources, I found that there are a number of terms which have been used for these musicians. Goyanda, Khwanandagan, Dhar, Khunyagaran, Kalavant, so on and so forth. And each of them represented a different category. I mean, for example, Kalavant was the person who was an expert in Drupa, for example. And then, as you also mentioned, Dargah Quli Khan. By 18th century, we have so much information about the music which is being played in two ways, not the courtly music, but the music within the public. Again, two types, where there is a music which is religious in character, and then music which is for gaiety. For example, Qawwali itself ultimately turns into a religious music. Or for that matter, by 19th century, we start getting paintings where that during the Muharrams, the bajas are being ensembles with the dhols and tashas and whatnot, making music not only in the Sufi dargahs, but also in the Tazia Khanas and Imam Baras. We know very well how music was being made in the temples. So there was one category of musicians who were devoted to this religious type of music, others who were performing in other type of festivities. So there is actually much which can be discussed. Last point which I would like to mention here is that I'm sorry, I am stressing more on musicians than on music itself, because the moment I start speaking on music, I'll commit howlers because on that. I try to study in a very limited fashion, as I said, basing only on the Persian sources, and that too only some of them. That what was the number of musicians in the court, how many of them were foreigners, how many of them were, indigenous, and whatever I could work. I know that my, numbers are not actual because the information is very limited. But whatever, I found that around 66% of the musicians who were in the court were Indians. And the others were, of course, those who came from other countries. Among the other countries, I found that among the foreigners who were recruited in the court, say from Akbar down to Aurangzeb, 66% of these foreigners were of Iranian music.
Yeah.
Whereas Central Asians, incidentally, Mughals were Central Asians, but Central Asians were only 33.3%. So the last question which I would like to put up to you is regarding this. That how much influence did the Iranian and Central Asian music have on the base which was Indian?
Yeah.
So can you explain that?
Oh, that's such a great question. So on the first issue about status of musicians, I've set this argument out elsewhere that my suggestion, it's very, very common for professional musicians in a lot of countries actually, that they have what is known as a liminal status, in the that they are occupationally liminal, in that they have extremely high respect for their abilities, which is why we know who they are and we know their names. But they are nonetheless still of service status. So none of them have mansabs, for example. So in relative status, they are of low status in comparison to their patrons. While at the same time, because they are permitted into the majlis because they have this liminal status because of the high respect and high importance of their art forms. So, I mean, that's it. It's always really puzzling as to why we know the names of these people. But it's I mean, that's one way to look at it. But yeah, certainly, definitely take your point there. Yes, on the music of Ajam. So there's a whole section in the Tawfat al-Hind, the chapter 5, which is on music, which delineates what he calls the music of Ajam. And what he means by that is the Persianate maqam and usul system. So maqam, and Mirza Khan says maqam, that is rag, and usul, that is tal. So he's actually understanding Iranian or West Asian system in Indian terms, which I think is very interesting. That system was prevalent in parts of Central Asia as well. So so certainly up to Samarkand. What is tricky is thinking about language. So there were songs being sung in Chagatai Turkey in Jahangir's reign. We know that. And we know that he, when people came from Central Asia, he would say, oh, please, sing something. Musicians would come and they would sing songs from Central Asia for him. But that does seem to have gone out. But the maqam system, the maqam and usul system, stays, and it is in some ways cognate with the Hindustani system, with the rags and tals. So you get Persian songs being sung in either maqam and usul or in rag and tal, which is because Persian, of course, is this massive lingua franca of this whole Persianate world. But you could also get experiments that appear in some of the scales that are used. So in one of these very technical treatises, there's a scale which he calls ghazal scale, which has a 3/4 tone re, which is not fixed 3/4 tone ray, which is not in the normal Hindustani system of tones. And it seems to me that they're using this particular fret setting to play Persian maqams on the Rudravina in this case. So there is a kind of a sense in which you can take maqams and you can play them on Indian instruments and vice versa. But at the same time, they're still recognized as different systems. So you do get these lists at the back of music treatises, even into the 19th century, saying, oh, and these are the Persian maqams. What is the case is that they're certainly being used, the Persian system is certainly being used for the ghazal in mushairas throughout the 18th century. So Mir Taqi Mir, in his Zikri Mir, his autobiography, on 2 occasions mentions the names of musical modes coming from the Persian system that are being used to set Persian ghazals in, particularly in a Sufi setting. You also get the emergence of rags and tals, which are taken over from maqams. So Hijaji, Rag Hijaji was maqam Hijaz. The scale of Bhairava is a scale that came across from the Persian system. And you get a tal, which is now called surfakhta in India, and it's often used by qawwals, which was usul-e-fakhta. So it was a Persian cycle, which became an Indian tal. Same with the rag sarparda. It's a beautiful rag, which is one of the branches of maqam rast. So there's this very interesting musical interchange, which is relatively small, actually, but it's still, it's still really interesting. So
I'm sorry, because you have to give another lecture on that.
I'm going to have to. Yes.
Well, I think we have taken enough time, and it was a really very interesting session.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. You can see that the sun is coming down in where I am. So, and I realize it's nighttime where you are.
Can you devote 10-20 seconds just for one small piece of which you can?
Sure. So what I will do is I'll sing. So my Hindustani singing, I actually don't even mention in public who my ustad was, because he would be ashamed of my terrible singing. But this is one of the songs that was taken by Sophia Plowden and put into musical notation, and it was the most famous Nachtkal song of the late 18th, early 19th century. Mutri bhi khush nawabegu, taza bataza no bano. And I've adapted it so it's a little bit like Bhairavi. So it's hard to switch from spoken to singing. Mutri bhi khush nawabegu, taza bataza no bano. Badai dil khusha bejo, taza bataza no bano. Basana mi chalubati, khush benashin bakhalvati. Busa sultan bakamazu, taza bataza no bano. Taza bataza no bano.
Thank you, Taza Bataza Nova Nova.
My pleasure.
Once again, I really want to thank the large number of people who attended this session. There were many people who were, in fact, listening live to you, Katherine. And it was a beautiful session. And we are going to put it up on the YouTube. Those who could not attend it live would be then ultimately listening to what you had to say. And it was actually a session where whatever doubts one had about Mughals and music, I think, would have been cleared by now.
Oh,
Music
thank you.
has a language of its own,
It
and
does.
when we talk about our shared past, music is something which actually joins all kinds of civilizations
It
together.
does.
Thank
It
you
does.
very much.
Thank you
Uh,
so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
uh, Shagufta, you have to say something.
Thank you. I think this was such a beautiful session. I mean, we're 2 hours plus and we have maintained our audience. What else can I say as a
Oh,
testimony to this? So
oh well,
wonderful.
it's just such a joy on a Sunday afternoon to sit here and talk about music, which Nadeem, to you, it's so true. This is something that we all share and which you know connects and unites us. And when times are so troubled, and so difficult for so many of us stuck in our houses, this is something that, you know, the light shines in the darkness when we.
Catherine, I'll just read out one comment which has
Yeah.
just come in. Catherine, that's for you. Please listen.
Gee,
One can learn from the speaker how to be so learned and so good natured at the same time.
thank
This is
you.
by a professor of English at Aligarh Muslim University, Professor Dr. Asim Siddiqui.
Oh, bless you. Thank you so much.
Another comment here, another lecture, please. And I think we're certain that there's going to be another lecture here. But if music be the food of love, play on. So
Shakespeare, another character who links us all, I think. So
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
Well,
So thank you so very much, Dr. Catherine Schofield. Like, it's been wonderful to have you and lovely, just absolutely great audience. Thank you so very much. And thank you, Professor Rizavi, for always being there to guide us.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
look forward to having you and again, and
My
hopefully
pleasure.
on the number of topics that everyone else has suggested, starting from the ragas to the white Mughals, to zodiac signs and connections, and old ragas, and of course, a whole lot of questions that have come up your way. I mean,
Mm.
tantric ragas,
Oh
all
yeah.
kinds of
Oh yeah. Oh, we
questions as well.
old ragas would be great.
Yes, I think everybody wants to know more about that. That rag gond, how did it become from
Oh
this
yeah.
beautiful? How did it transform the beautiful to a Sringar Naika representation? How did it happen?
Yeah,
So, a
yeah.
lot of questions, and we are going to be also equipped with more musical knowledge so that we can address these. Um, yeah, this is getting really technical here. So
Great.
that's great. So thank you so very much,
Oh,
both
it's
of
my
you,
pleasure.
and thank you to the audience. Absolutely joyous, wonderful, and in the festive season, we want to thank you for taking time out. This is just a day after Diwali, and for a large number of us, it's still the festive season. So thank
Absolutely.
you for spending your evening with us.
Oh,
Have
my
a great
pleasure.
evening. Yes. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Next Friday, Professor Rizavi, would you like to announce now or shall we do this later?
we will announce it, but we have two lectures, as all of you know, that on Friday and Sunday. On Friday, we will have a lecture on the sources for the study of the Mughal Empire, and on Sunday, we would be continuing with this series, reflections on our shared past. So we would be putting up posters, and but be there. Our time is on Friday and Sunday, 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time. So be there. There are a lot of scholars, lot of historians who are going to be presenting their viewpoints as far as our past is concerned. Thank you very much.